So one of the things we didn't really get to talk about in this behind the scenes series is the voiceover process, which is a shame because it was honestly one of my favorite parts of producing this series, was directing the voice acting and the performances. But if you want to find out more about that and what that process was like, I recommend looking at the production diary that we did that focused on that aspect of creating this show. And in it you can find out how we captured the voiceover and what that process was like, and get to know some of the amazing voice actors that we were able to work with to get these strong performances for the characters, which I'm really proud of our whole cast for putting out. So episode 10 starts out very deep into the Outlands. At this point, they are pretty far gone and morale is low, but this also provides an opportunity for Vera to kind of step up and become the leader figure. And then we have the Monk Temple. Now the Monk Temple is deliberately meant to stick out like a sore thumb on this landscape. We don't exactly specify much about their culture or what kind of monks they are, but Lauren was very much inspired by the sort of Shaolin monks of the East and attempted to replicate that aesthetic. So one of the members of our art team, who was credited as Hugo Weiland, was actually very interested in Asian culture and contributed quite a bit to the design of that location, and quite a bit to some of the background of it as well. One of the World of Edeneth title cards that we cut away to in the middle of the episodes contained some contributions from him. And kind of using that knowledge that he already had, he actually designed quite a bit of the interiors of those buildings. Initially, the exterior was pretty much designed by Lauren and then built by a handful of builders very early on in production, but he actually was the one who decided pretty much the style of the interiors and what sort of objects or shrines they might have in a location like this. And then he also designed the monk skins that all of the monks were wearing inside the temple. Now for the monks, we used NPC villagers and reskinned them almost like how we did with the civilians early on in production. But this time we didn't have to cut off their arms and make them all nubbly, because the arm and sleeve look actually really fit with the monk aesthetic, and he actually included some very neat details that you don't really get to see. Each monk has a very unique symbol attached to them on their robes.
So the first thing you see when you see the Monk Temple are these giant doors that are up front. So getting those doors to open was actually pretty easy because it ended up just being frame animation. What I did was I went down below and had each door open in each stage of its opening, and then I would just have commands that were running that would clone the current state of the door up to the top, so that and replace it, so that way it would slowly show each stage of its animation opening. And I used that a couple different times in this series that you might see.
And so it's at this episode as well that we start to see the kingdom on their last legs, and we want to give a big grandiose sense to this montage that accompanies it, and really that large scale wouldn't be possible without Blockbuster. As you can see in the shot where we show the establishing over Centaurus and all of the people moving about the police station, this was way more people than we had available as body actors, and we wanted to have a lot of activity and really make it look like a mass exodus. So episode 11, the final battle. This is an episode that was mostly action sequence, and action is hands down the hardest part of the show to shoot. It's way more difficult per capita of screen time because dialogue is just head bobbing and getting the blocking of the scene and the timing right. But action sequences, every single shot is its own unique challenge.
So getting Scourge's powers to look just right was really hard but really fun, because at the time the Illagers had just come out, and they actually had a magical spellcaster who would cast a spell at you. It was really new at the time. I was like, all right, I want to take this effect and I want to use it somehow in this series. So then I came up with the idea that he would have like this shockwave of a spell that he would use. And then I was like, okay, that's a good idea. I can use that. And these chompers would come out in this shockwave. So it ended up just being the real simplified version where they pop up in the blocks, and it just syncs up with the acting, and they would just tell me when it would go, and I would turn on the effect and turn it off. And getting the lightning effect was pretty easy. That was also just synchronization between me in an underground bunker and the actors up top, and that was pretty easy. It was just a lightning bolt and a piece of TNT.
Now, as I mentioned in the previous BTS videos, every character had very unique props that they used for their weapons. And Scourge actually had a very powerful diamond sword that he was wielding for every scene we show him fighting in, which basically KOs any player in one hit, regardless of how much armor they have. However, there were points where we needed soldiers to die to environment and to die to things that weren't his sword. For example, when he cast spells such as the lightning. And in instances such as that, those did pretty much a set amount of damage, which meant for us that we basically had to make sure every body actor was sufficiently damaged before going into that shot. And so between takes, we would just start hitting them until everyone was low on health, and then they would go into the shot and hopefully all die when they get hit.
So getting the shots where all of the archers are shooting down a hail of arrows at Scourge was pretty challenging, because first of all, we didn't have that many people to use, and getting blockbuster actors to shoot flaming arrows was impossible. What I ended up doing was I just filmed myself shooting a bunch of fire arrows in the positions that the archers would be in the actual shot. And then I would chroma key out the sky and the supports that I was using, and I was left with just these arrows flying through the air from the same positions that the archers were in the scene. And then getting the shot where the camera is following the arrows through the sky, that was actually pretty easy, because what I did was those arrows on my end weren't actually moving. I just shot them into an invisible block and then filmed them, took the camera and just moved the camera around to make it look like the arrows were moving. And then I duplicated that a bunch of times in the scene, and then moved those around within the frame to make it look like the camera was moving dynamically around with these arrows flying through the sky. And then of course the shot where he actually just gets pelted with arrows was interesting, because we just had a bunch of dispensers, a whole wall of dispensers that we just covered in lava because we needed the arrows to fly through the lava to catch on fire. And that was just funny. That was fun to do.
So destroying the capital was very troublesome. We did quite a few real TNT explosions at first in order to get a realistic destruction of the environment, in addition to particles that Lauren would have going to make the explosion more grand. But this ended up lagging us down quite a bit, and I couldn't, in this case, reduce my render distance because I needed it in order to get the big long oneer in replay mod where we could see quite a bit of the landscape. And so this took a significant amount of tries to get right, because essentially everything was laggy and our inputs were extremely delayed. And essentially whenever we would jump off to start our elytra flight, we wouldn't even always go into flight because it was just that bad. So it was essentially a matter of brute force and doing it so many times until it worked.
When Scourge captures Spade, that little bedrock prison that he makes for him, I wasn't sure I was going to do that. Even still, I'm not really happy with the first time that we used it, because the first way that we used it, they just appear. There's no big effect. There's nothing really to signify that something had happened. The second time that we used it in the throne room, I was much happier with it, because I figured out a way that I can have them appear and have the block breaking effect where it looked like they popped into existence and there was an effect to it. There was a punch.
So the finale was also mostly battle, and we essentially wanted to have this big epic confrontation from two characters with what we like to call mod-like powers. So writing this episode was essentially thinking of a bunch of interesting challenges in which they could meet each other using their creative mode powers. Not all of these made it into the show, especially since we were on a pretty major time crunch at this point to get the episode made. In fact, we had to delay this episode an additional week just to make sure we had enough time to complete it. But that allowed us to do a little interesting bit of promotion, which was having Scourge read Invictus, because I thought it very well reflected his character. And now what's interesting about Invictus is that is also the name of the finale episode, because I think the general thematics of it is something that fits Scourge to a T. Generally people refer to Invictus as this very uplifting kind of poem, but prior to writing some of this series, I'd heard this perspective that I'd never before heard on it, which is the sort of almost pride and vanity aspect to it.
The final tower that you see Scourge erecting from the ground is actually the first version of the tower that we had. The first version of the tower that we had was way too big, and this is actually the version of the tower that you see in the intro when Scourge is sitting in his throne opposite of Opal. I tried to get that tower in the scene, but it was literally too big to use. The reason it was too big was because I needed to use structure blocks. They have this thing where they can summon in the structure that you save in percentages of completion. It would start off really low and just kind of blocks would appear so that it looked like this building was coming out of thin air. The first one that I used was literally too big for the structure blocks to handle. I had to build a second tower that was restrained to the dimensions that the structure blocks are able to work with.
So we were able to experiment with a lot of interesting effects throughout the Vera versus Scourge fight, and a lot of them were just pretty simple effects that were illusions that were essentially only a matter of timing. For example, when they hit each other, sending them flying across a good distance, essentially putting one of them in survival mode, having them actually get hit by the sword and have enough absorption to take the hit, and then having various particle effects to detonate the place that they impact in, and then more of the same sort of particle effects and summoning in blocks that Lauren did before on spawning multiple cannons simultaneously.
Or even if Raph was in survival mode, he was outside of the range of the ghast. So that was actually me behind the ghast summoning in a gas fireball that I would punch. I would literally just punch it, rather, at the direction of the camera to get that effect, because that gas just didn't have any idea what was going on in that scene.
But yeah, it was certainly allowed for a very different style of action than we had in all of the other episodes, and it also allowed for some pretty interesting sequences, such as the big, long oneer as Vera chases Scourge, and we really got pretty fortunate with a sort of one and done take with that scene, and I don't think we did it any more than 2 times when we got that amazing take that we ended up using
throughout the episode. And almost every single time we see a dragon actually die is all done using lots and lots of compositing, getting these dragons, which I would just film on a green screen, and again using the same technique that I used on the arrow, where the dragon would be standing still and the movement of the dragon in the frame was the camera on a path moving relative to the dragon.
Then towards the end, we really upped the ante with dragons and having Vera and Scourge meet each other, each with a set of dragons. Now the problem is that was very difficult because we couldn't actually have that many dragons on the screen at the same time. Even as we learned in episode 6, having one was troublesome enough. So essentially we shot each of their parts separately and had all dragons in the world moving in the same direction as Vera flew by and led them, and then did the same with Scourge and then rotoscoped both of those shots together. And actually, the particle effects that occur when a dragon dies don't actually happen when they die in the overworld. So every time you see that big purple light, that is actually composited in very deliberately, and Lauren got some great shots of that effect on its own that was very easy to chroma key and then just impose into any shot that we desired. So Lauren composited most of those effects. The only one of those that I did was on Scourge's final death, in which case we essentially filtered out all of the blue in the purple streaks of light so that only red remained, and then Scourge essentially had a death that was very much like that of an ender dragon, except with the red lights coming out of him.
When Scourge lands and he creates this little crater that he just kind of lies down and defeated, a lot of that actually was just retextured beds, because there are no dirt half blocks, and also we needed him lying down in dirt, so I retextured. I just literally grabbed the dirt texture, threw it over the beds.
So the final episode featured a lot of rotoscoped and composited shots, but one of the most grueling rotoscopes I had to do in this whole series was in this final episode, and it was when... why you insufferable.
You tagged him, Vera. Finish him off.
The spectral arrow effect did not show on the shaders that we were using. And so basically, thankfully we were using replay mod, I had to go over and record the same shot 2 different times, once with shaders, once without, and then rotoscope Scourge out of the shot that didn't have shaders into the shot with them to get the result that you see in the final cut. So interesting thing about this finale is that there are actually 2 different endings for this series that were quite drastically different. But the version that I had originally written was one that was a little bit less bleak and a little bit more of a happy ending in which things work out a little bit better for our main characters. But essentially at a certain point, after talking to one very good friend of mine in particular, and not even about the story itself, but just about things, I began to realize how much I sort of disagreed with that ending. And eventually I went ahead and did a full rewrite of the final episode. Not a full rewrite, the first half is pretty much the exact same, but the second half of the episode is quite drastically different. And that second version of the ending is actually the version that you see in the final product. That was not the original ending that we envisioned, and the entire closing montage is entirely different. But perhaps one day we'll release that alternate ending. Perhaps we won't, but we'll see what happens of it, but it's an interesting fact to note. But then, of course, we have that big sentimental closing montage in which we kind of see what comes of the characters and see where they're at in the world, in their own personal arcs, where we might perhaps one day see them again, either in a second season if that ever becomes a possibility, or the anthology series that we have coming up. Now, interesting fact is that the post-credit scenes were shot the day that the episode was released. Those were a very last-minute addition, but I just kind of felt like there was room for that little bit of extra footage, and I felt like it would help to close it out in a smoother way. But nonetheless, that is the final episode of the series, and Edeneth was, bar none, the most ambitious project we've done to date, and really it was an incredible learning experience. Learning to work with a huge crew and produce long pipelines the way that we did was certainly something that I carry with me every day now. And it's actually, as I'm doing more production work of this variety, it's really something that I've been able to apply just constantly. And while it had its ups and downs, its hardships and trials, ultimately I don't think I would trade that experience for anything, because it is certainly something that has helped me to grow both personally and professionally. And I think Edeneth, regardless of what comes of it, regardless of whether we decide to continue the story, I think it's definitely going to be something that will forever hold a special place in my heart.